I have stayed too long. I am sorry, Isaiah, I should go. Nora Easton said the words quietly, her voice barely carrying over the low crackle of the fire in the hearth. She had already risen from the wooden chair beside his kitchen table, already reached for her shawl where it hung on the peg near the door, already composed her expression into something polite and distant, the kind of face she had practiced for years, the face that said she needed nothing, wanted nothing, expected nothing from anyone. Isaiah Granger did not move for a long moment. He sat at his table with his hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and he really looked at her, in a way that made the air between them feel suddenly too thin, too charged, like the sky before a thunderstorm rolls in off the mountains. "Nora," he said, just her name, nothing more. She turned, her hand resting on the door latch, her knuckles pale with the effort of appearing calm when her chest felt like it was caving in, because she had learned long ago that caring too much was its own kind of dangerous, its own kind of trap, and she had already cared far too much for this quiet, complicated man. "It is late," she said. "I have been here since morning. That is too much of your time. I am sorry I have been sitting here the last half hour," Isaiah said, and his voice was rougher than usual, raw at the edges in a way that made her fingers tighten around the door latch, "trying to figure out how to ask you to stay longer." The words landed in the room like something irreversible. Nora Easton stood very still. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls of the ranch house, carrying the smell of sage and dust and the distant promise of rain, and the fire snapped once in the hearth, and the whole world seemed to narrow down to the space between her hand on that door latch and his eyes across the room, those dark, careful, guarded eyes that had been watching her for months with something he had never allowed himself to put into words until this exact moment. She let go of the latch. The sound of it releasing was very small, but it felt enormous. She had come to Carver's Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the spring of 1878, with almost nothing to her name and a darkness riding her back that she had carried so long it had started to feel like her own shadow. She had not come looking for love. She had not come looking for anything as fragile or as dangerous as love. She had come because she had run out of other directions to go, and because the advertisement in the Denver newspaper had promised honest work and a clean start, and because she had been desperate enough to believe that a clean start was still possible for a woman with her particular history. The advertisement had belonged to one Margaret Granger, who ran the Carver's Creek post office and general store alongside her son Isaiah, and who had needed a second pair of hands since her arthritis had gotten bad enough to make the bookkeeping a torture. Nora had answered the advertisement from Denver, had received a careful, formal letter in return, had packed everything she owned into a single worn leather bag, and had boarded the westbound stage with the kind of determination that is really just fear wearing a different coat. She had not known, stepping off that stage into the dust and glare of Carver's Creek on a Thursday afternoon in April, that the quiet man standing beside Margaret Granger, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a jaw set like he was carrying something heavy, and had decided he would simply carry it forever, was going to become the most significant person in her life within a matter of months. She had not known it because she had not allowed herself to know it. Isaiah Granger was 29 years old in the spring of 1878, which was 2 years older than Nora, and he had the manner of a man who had lived considerably more of life than his years might suggest. He ran the ranch attached to the Granger property, 160 acres of Wyoming grassland, a good well, a solid barn, and a herd of cattle that he managed with his hired hand, a steady older man named Walt Prout who chewed tobacco and spoke only when he had something worth saying, which Isaiah had always respected. Isaiah had been to the war. He did not talk about it. There was a scar along his left forearm that Nora had noticed on her second day at the Granger property, when he had rolled up his sleeves to help move a supply crate that had arrived on the freight wagon, and she had looked away quickly, understanding without needing to be told that the scar was part of the locked room inside him, the part he did not open for anyone. Margaret Granger had told her the broad strokes herself, in that frank and practical way that older ranch women often had, dispensing information the way they dispensed flour in measured amounts, with nothing wasted. He was at Chickamauga, Margaret had said, on Nora's third evening while they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains orange and violet. Came back different. Not broken. Isaiah is not a man who breaks, but different, quieter. He had a girl in town before the war. Clara Whitfield, pretty girl, could not wait for him. Married a merchant from Cheyenne by the time Isaiah came home. She had paused, rocking in her chair, looking at the mountains. He has not looked at a woman since, as far as I can tell, and I am his mother, so I notice these things. She had said it without pointed emphasis, without the look that people sometimes gave, that matchmaking look that made Nora's skin prickle with resistance. She had simply said it as fact, and Nora had absorbed it as fact, and had filed it carefully in the part of her mind where she stored things she needed to understand about a situation without acting on. She had her own locked rooms. She had come west from Ohio originally, though Denver was the most recent stop in a series of stops that had begun 6 years earlier when her father, Harlan Easton, had made a business agreement with a man named Gerald Colton that had, in the manner of certain agreements made by certain men, been made about Nora without Nora's knowledge or meaningful consent. Gerald Colton had been 43 years old and had owned a dry goods operation in Columbus and had been looking for a wife of the domestic and decorative variety, and Harlan Easton had owed Gerald Colton money, a significant and accumulating amount of money rooted in a failed livestock venture, and the solution that had presented itself to both men had felt very clean and very logical to both men, and very much like a trap to Nora, who was 21 at the time and had just realized she had been walking into it for years. She had not married Gerald Colton. She had left instead. It had taken courage that she still sometimes marveled at, looking back, because leaving without permission in 1872 as a woman of 21 was not a simple thing. She had taken the money she had saved from 3 years of giving piano lessons, had told no one, had boarded a train heading west at 4 in the morning, and had not stopped moving for very long since. Pittsburgh to Cincinnati, Cincinnati to St. Louis, St. Louis to Kansas City, Kansas City to Denver, Denver to Carver's Creek. Each city a fresh start that turned gradually into a reason to move again, not because of dramatic disaster each time, but because of the slow accumulation of aloneness that comes when a woman has no family, no community, no roots, and no one who knows her whole story. She was 27, and she was tired of moving. She just had not known it until she arrived in Carver's Creek. The Granger property was 3 miles east of town, set against a long ridge of low hills that caught the afternoon light in a way that made them glow like something out of a painting. The house was solid 2 stories, proper siding, a kitchen garden on the south side that Margaret tended with fierce devotion and painful hands. The store and post office were in town, and Nora's official duties were divided between them. 3 mornings a week in town managing the accounts and assisting with customers, and the remaining time helping Margaret with the household correspondence, the inventory records, and whatever else needed 2 good hands. What had not been part of the official arrangement was the way the work expanded naturally to include the ranch itself, because Margaret's hands were too bad for certain tasks, and Isaiah was too proud to ask for help he did not think he deserved, and Walt Prout was a man of few words but also of very specific job definitions, and so Nora had simply begun, quietly and without announcement, to do things. She kept the ranch ledgers. She mended the fence line records, not the fences themselves. She was not foolish, but the documentation of which sections were repaired and when, which mattered for the territorial land agreements. She organized the supply orders for winter feed. She helped Margaret put up the summer preserves. She sat at the kitchen table in the evenings, sometimes, when the work of the day had been particularly demanding, and the walk back to the room she rented in town felt like more than she had energy for. And she and Isaiah and Margaret would eat supper together, and then Margaret would go to bed early as she always did, and Nora and Isaiah would sit with the remains of the evening, the quiet fire, the tin cups, the particular comfortable silence that develops between people who have decided, without discussion, to trust each other. That silence had started as nothing more than exhausted coexistence. It had gradually become the thing Nora looked forward to most in each day. She had noticed it happening and had been alarmed by it and had been very careful, very deliberate, in managing her own expectations. She had a history of hidden motives being used against her. Her father's agreement with Colton, a landlady in Kansas City who had been reporting her location to someone she never fully identified, a charming man in Denver who had seemed kind, and turned out to be interested primarily in whether she could be convinced to hand over her savings for his freighting venture. She had learned, through these experiences, to be suspicious of anything that felt too good, too safe, too warm. Isaiah Granger felt too good, too safe, and too warm. She had therefore been extremely careful. She had not touched him unnecessarily. She had not sought his company beyond what the work required. She had maintained, at all times, a polite and professional warmth that gave away nothing of what had started building in her chest from approximately the 4th week of her employment. When Isaiah had come into the kitchen at dusk, after a long day moving cattle in the south pasture, had sat down without a word, had accepted the plate of food she slid across the table without being asked, and had looked at her with such simple and unguarded gratitude that something inside her had cracked quietly open. He had a way of looking at her. That was the thing she could not defend against. He did not look at her the way some men looked at women, assessing, calculating, seeing what use might be made of her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he values deeply and is afraid to damage. There was a carefulness to it that was also a kind of reverence, and it undid her every single time. She was very good at not showing that it undid her. For 4 months she had been very good at it. And then came the day in August when the summer heat had broken into the kind of golden, perfect afternoon that Wyoming sometimes produces like a gift. And Nora had been in the kitchen garden cutting herbs for Margaret's medicine bundle, and Isaiah had come around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her. And for one unguarded moment, one careless, honest, terrifying moment, neither of them had managed to maintain the careful distance they had been keeping. And they had simply looked at each other in the warm afternoon light, and the truth of what had been growing between them had been entirely, undeniably visible. Then Walt Prout had called from the barn, and Isaiah had turned away, and Nora had bent back to her herbs with fingers that were not quite steady. That evening she had almost not stayed for supper. She had stayed because Margaret had asked her directly, and she could not say no to Margaret, and because she was honest enough with herself to admit that she had wanted to stay, that the wanting was the danger, and that she was choosing the danger anyway because she was 27 years old and she had been choosing safety over everything she wanted for 6 years, and she was very, very tired of it. After supper, after Margaret retired, the silence settled over the kitchen the way it always did, companionable and full. Isaiah had been quieter than usual. Nora had busied herself with the account book she had brought from town, making entries by the lamplight with careful precision, telling herself she was simply finishing work, telling herself the warmth in the room had nothing to do with the man sitting 10 feet away reading the week-old newspaper he had received in the mail that morning. The clock on the mantel had moved through its careful business, and the fire had burned lower, and at some point Nora had looked up and found Isaiah looking at her and had looked back down immediately and had written a figure in the wrong column and had to scratch it out. She had stayed too long. She had known she was staying too long. She had kept staying, and the wanting had kept building, and the fear had kept its cold hand on her shoulder, and she had finally risen from her chair and reached for her shawl and said the words that had brought them to this moment. "I have stayed too long. I am sorry, Isaiah." And he had said, "I have been sitting here the last half hour trying to figure out how to ask you to stay longer." She let go of the door latch, and she turned back to the room, and she looked at him. Isaiah Granger was looking at her with the most undefended expression she had ever seen on his face. He was a man who had built very careful walls. She knew that walls made of the war, of Clara Whitfield's betrayal, of years of quiet solitude that had hardened into something he had mistaken for preference. And right now, in the firelight, with his cold coffee and his week-old newspaper and the wind pressing against the windows, those walls were simply gone. "Sit back down, Nora," he said. "Please," she sat. Not because he said please, though that mattered. She sat because her legs would not have carried her out the door even if she had wanted them to. She sat because something that had been held under tension for 4 months was releasing, and she needed the chair under her, needed the solid wood and the solid table and the solid fact of this room to keep herself from feeling entirely untethered. She sat and she put her shawl in her lap, and she looked at him across the table, and the space between them, which had always felt carefully managed, felt now like the only honest thing in the room. "I do not know how to do this," Isaiah said. His voice was low and deliberate, the way he spoke when he was saying something he had thought about carefully and was choosing not to retreat from. "I have not," he stopped. He set down the tin cup. He looked at his hands, then back at her. "I have been alone a long time, not because I prefer it. I think I convinced myself I preferred it because the alternative," he paused again. "Because wanting something and losing it is a specific kind of pain, and I had decided I was done choosing it." "I know that particular decision," Nora said. Something moved across his face. "I imagine you do." There was a pause that was not uncomfortable, the way their silences never were. "What changed tonight?" She asked because she was brave in the ways that mattered, even when she was afraid. "You said you were sorry," he said, "for staying, and I thought," he shook his head slightly, something wry and painful in the expression. "I thought if she walks out that door thinking she needs to apologize for being here, then I have failed completely at the one thing I actually wanted to tell her." Nora's hands tightened on the shawl in her lap. "What thing?" she asked softly. "That there is no part of this house, no hour of this day, that is not better for your being in it," Isaiah said. "That I have been sitting here every evening afraid to say that because I do not know what you want, and I do not have the right to assume, and you are—" He paused, and something flickered in his eyes that was almost humor, almost anguish, almost everything at once. "You are very good at keeping your own counsel, Nora Easton." A sound escaped her that was halfway to a laugh. "I have had practice." "I know," he said, "and I am not asking you to give that up. I am not asking you to explain anything you do not want to explain. I am only asking," he stopped himself, seemed to collect something, and then said it plainly, "stay, not just tonight. Stay in a way that means something." The fire crackled. The wind moved against the windows. Nora Easton looked at Isaiah Granger across the kitchen table of his mother's house on a Tuesday night in August 1878. And she thought about all the years she had spent running away from the wrong things and running toward nothing in particular. And she thought about the locked rooms inside herself that she had been so careful to guard. And she thought about the garden, and the ledgers, and the evenings, and the way he looked at her like she was something worth being careful with. "I am afraid," she said. It cost her something to say it, not everything but something. "So am I," he said immediately. "I have been afraid since April." "Since April," she repeated. "Since the day you arrived and organized my mother's account books in one afternoon and told Walt that the fence posts on the east section needed retreating before first frost and were absolutely right about it." He said it with a straight face, but there was warmth under it, deep and real. "I was afraid of you before I was anything else." "Afraid of me," she said. "Afraid of what you made me want," he corrected. The thing in Nora's chest that had been held under tension for 4 months let go entirely. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had trained herself out of it years ago, on the grounds that tears were a luxury she could not afford and a vulnerability she could not safely expose. But her eyes were bright now in the firelight, and she did not try to hide it. "I have been afraid of the same thing," she said. Since she thought about when exactly. Not April. Later. The day in June when he had ridden back from town in a downpour and she had met him at the barn door with a dry blanket and he had taken it from her without looking surprised, as if she had always been there, as if her being there was simply true. Since June, I think. The rain. He was quiet for a moment. "I remember that day." "So do I," she said. Another silence, warmer than before. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Isaiah said, "I suppose I ask you properly." He shifted in his chair and she could see it cost him something too, the unguarded act of it, the exposure. "I am not a simple man to know, Nora. I have parts of myself I have not figured out how to share with anyone. The war left things in me that I am still working through most days. I am not," he searched for the word. "I am not an easy promise." "I am not looking for easy," she said. "I have never trusted easy. Easy always turned out to be a different kind of trap." He looked at her steadily. "What happened to you?" "Things that are mine to tell in my own time," she said, "if you can give me that." "I can give you all the time there is," he said. The simplicity of it, the total absence of performance in how he said it, was the most devastating thing she had experienced in years. She breathed. "Then yes," she said, "I will stay." The change that came over his face was not dramatic. He was not a dramatic man. It was a quieter thing, a loosening, a settling, as if something that had been braced against a possible blow had decided the blow was not coming after all. He exhaled slowly, and he reached across the table, not quickly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, and he laid his hand open on the wood between them. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers carefully, as if she were something that mattered enormously. They sat like that for a long while, with the fire burning low and the wind outside, and the whole dark and beautiful Wyoming night pressing in around the walls of the house. And neither of them said anything else for a long time, because everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything else was still being understood. The weeks that followed were some of the most complicated and most luminous of Nora's life. Nothing changed abruptly. The pace of things in Carver's Creek, the pace of life on the land itself, did not encourage abruptness. The cattle needed tending, the store needed managing, the summer canning needed finishing, the correspondence needed answering. Isaiah did not suddenly become a different man because he had said what he said, and Nora did not suddenly become a different woman because she had said what she said. They were still themselves, still careful, still carrying their respective locked rooms. But the nature of the space between them had shifted into something acknowledged, and that acknowledgement changed everything at a cellular level, the way iron filing patterns shift when a magnet is brought near. He started finding reasons to be in the kitchen when she was working there. Not obvious reasons, not clumsy pretexts. He was too subtle for that and too honest. He would simply appear with something that legitimately needed doing nearby, a hinge that needed tightening on the cabinet door, a shelf bracket that had worked loose, and he would work quietly while she worked quietly, and they would talk or not talk, and both states felt equally right. He had a way of listening when she did talk that she found almost unbearably moving. Most people listened in order to respond. Isaiah listened the way a person reads something they want to understand fully before forming any opinion, with his whole attention, without hurry, without the slight impatience of someone waiting for their own turn to speak. When she said something and he waited a moment before answering, she knew it was because he was actually thinking about what she had said, and she had never in her life felt so thoroughly received by another person. She told him things gradually, not all at once, not in a flood. The way water finds its way through stone, one quiet passage at a time. She told him about Ohio, about her mother who had died when she was 12 and had left her alone with Nora Easton, who was not a cruel man but was a man primarily interested in his own survival, which had made him capable of cruelty when it served that survival. She told him about the piano lessons, that she had genuinely loved music, had found something in it that felt like the interior of herself made audible, and had had to leave that too when she left Ohio. She told him about the train at 4 in the morning, about looking out the window as Columbus disappeared into the darkness behind her, about the terror and the freedom braided together in her chest. He listened to all of it. He did not say it would have been better if she had stayed. He did not say she should have found another way. He simply received it as the truth of what had happened and said, very quietly, "You have been braver than most people will ever know." She had to excuse herself after that, on the grounds of checking something in the supply shed, and she stood in the cool, dusty dark of the shed for 5 minutes pressing her hands against her face, managing the thing that had risen in her throat. She told him about the man in Denver too, the one with the freighting venture and the charming manner. She had not given him the savings, some instinct had stopped her at the last moment, but she had given him months of trust, and the discovery of the deception had been a kind of small betrayal that sat in her like a splinter she could not reach to remove. Isaiah's face went very still when she told him that story. His name. He asked, and there was something in his voice that she had not heard before. "It does not matter," she said. "He is not in Denver anymore as far as I know. He moved on. Men like that always move on." Isaiah looked at his hands for a moment, then he looked back at her. "If I ever encounter a man like that," he said, "I will have things to say to him." "You are very calm about saying something threatening," she observed. "I am a very calm man," he said, and the slight dryness in it made her laugh, and his expression shifted into something she was beginning to identify as the Isaiah Granger equivalent of a wide grin. He did not smile often, but when he did the full version, the rare version, it rearranged her completely. Margaret Granger watched all of this with the careful attention of a woman who had managed to be both tactful and absolutely nosy for the entirety of her 61 years on Earth. She said nothing direct. She was too wise for that. She simply arranged circumstances with quiet efficiency, suddenly remembering she needed to retire early, suddenly finding reasons to be in the other room, suddenly producing a bottle of last year's blackberry wine that she had been saving for no articulated reason, and then deciding she herself would not have any, but Nora and Isaiah should certainly not let it go to waste. In September, Isaiah asked Nora to walk with him to the South Ridge on Sunday afternoon. It was the first thing they had done together that was entirely outside the work, the first thing that had no practical justification, that was simply being together, in the world, in the open air. Nora had understood what it meant, understood that he was saying something by suggesting it, and had said yes without hesitation. They walked the 3 miles to the South Ridge in the long September afternoon, through grass that had gone gold at the tips, and along the dry creek bed where the cottonwoods were beginning to turn. Isaiah walked with an unhurried stride that Nora had to lengthen her steps slightly to match, and she was aware the whole time of his arm near hers, the occasional brush of sleeves when the path narrowed, nothing more, and nothing more was needed. At the top of the ridge, which was not dramatic, not a cliff, not a precipice, just a long elevated line with the valley spread below and the mountains filling the western sky, they stopped and looked. The Absaroka Range was visible to the northwest on clear days, and this was a clear day. The mountains were snow-capped already at the highest elevations, white against the deep autumn blue, and the valley between the ridge and the mountains was a mosaic of gold and brown and the dark green of the pines along the watercourses. "I used to come up here after the war," Isaiah said, "when I needed to remember why the place mattered, why any of it mattered." Nora stood beside him and looked at the mountains. "Did it work?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Less when I was up here alone, more now." A pause. "With you here considerably more." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains, but he was aware of her looking. She could see it in the set of his jaw. "Isaiah," she said, I know, he said. I am working up to something. Take your time, she said. He turned and looked at her, and the afternoon light was directly on his face, and she saw him clearly, the scar on his left forearm below his rolled sleeve, the gray that had started at his temples before he was 30, the lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into wide western distances, and the particular expression he wore when he was about to say something he could not retrieve once he said it. "I love you," he said. "I did not want to say it before I was sure you knew me well enough to judge whether I meant it properly. I think you know me well enough now." Nora felt the words enter her the way warmth enters a cold room, spreading, filling, reaching the corners. "I love you too," she said. "I have been afraid to say it." "You said it anyway," he observed. "You said it first," she said. "You made it easier." "Good," he said. "Then I will keep going first whenever it makes it easier." She turned to face him fully, and he turned to face her, and they were standing very close in the afternoon wind on the south ridge above the valley, and he raised his hand slowly and touched her face, one careful hand against her cheek. And the tenderness of it, the absolute and total tenderness, was the thing that finally, completely, dismantled every wall she had spent 6 years constructing. She leaned into his hand. He stepped forward and held her, there on the ridge, with the mountains watching and the autumn wind moving through the grass around them, and she put her arms around him and held back with everything she had, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and the silence was full to its very edges. He kissed her for the first time there on the ridge, quietly, without urgency, as if there was all the time in the world now and he intended to use it well. She kissed him back and thought, with the clarity that sometimes comes in the moments that matter most, "This is what I ran toward. I did not know it yet, but this is what I ran toward." The autumn moved forward. In October, Margaret Granger sat Nora down at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and said, without preamble, "My son has loved precisely one other woman in his life before you, and she broke something in him that took years to begin healing. I am telling you this not as a warning and not as a threat. I am telling you because you ought to know what you are taking care of." "I know about Clara," Nora said. "He told you." Margaret seemed unsurprised, even pleased. "Then you know he does not love carelessly. He is not a careless man. When he loves, it goes to the center of him. That is why it is dangerous, and that is why it is worth everything if you are the right person." She looked at Nora directly. "Are you the right person, Nora Easton?" "I intend to be," Nora said. "I cannot promise I will always get it right, but I intend to be." Margaret studied her for a long moment with the sharp eyes of a woman who had been reading people's intentions for 6 decades and rarely got it wrong. "Yes," she said simply. "I think you will." Nora carried that with her like a warm coal in her pocket for weeks. Isaiah's proposal came in November. On the first day it snowed, a light early snow, just enough to dust the ground and put white on the fence posts and make the whole world look briefly clean and new. He came into the kitchen from the barn in the late morning, snow on his shoulders, and found Nora at the table with the ledgers, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression she had learned to read as him deciding something. "I have something I want to ask you," he said. "I gathered," she said, closing the ledger. He sat across from her, not at the far end as he used to, but close, the new geography they had settled into, close enough to touch if touching was wanted. He looked at her with those careful, warm, entirely serious eyes, and he said, "I am going to ask you to marry me, and before I do, I want to say that I understand completely if the answer is not yes right now, or ever, because you are your own person and your own history has given you every reason not to trust easily, and I will be here regardless. I am not going anywhere." Nora looked at him, this man who prefaced his marriage proposal with a statement protecting her right to refuse it, and felt something enormous and quiet settle in her, something that had been restless for 27 years. "Isaiah," she said. "Yes. Ask me." He took her hands across the table, both of them, holding them the way he had the first night carefully, as if they were something valuable. "Will you marry me, Nora Easton?" he said. Will you stay here with me and my mother and this piece of land and build something with me that is entirely ours?" "Yes," she said. "Without reservation, yes." He brought her hands to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, and his hands were shaking very slightly, and she thought, "This man has been brave tonight in his own way, in his quiet and private way, and she would never underestimate that." "Good," he said against her hands, his voice rough. "That is very good." They were married in December, in Carver's Creek's small clapboard church, with Margaret Granger in the front pew radiating satisfaction, and Walt Prout in his best coat looking as stoic as ever, and the town's residents filling the remaining pews with the genuine warmth that occasionally characterized small community life when something worth celebrating presented itself. The minister, Reverend Thomas Cullen, was a practical man who kept the ceremony to the essential elements, which suited both Isaiah and Nora, who had each privately dreaded anything elaborate. When the ceremony came to the part about vows, and Nora looked at Isaiah Granger and said the words that mattered, the promising, the committing, the choosing, she said them with her whole self, without held-back corners, without reservation, which was the first time she had given herself fully to anything in 6 years, and it felt like stepping into light after a very long time in the dark. He said his vows back to her, and his voice did not waver, and his eyes did not leave hers, and she believed every word. Afterward, walking out of the church into the December cold with snowflakes drifting lazily from a pale sky, Isaiah took her hand and tucked it into the crook of his arm, and she leaned against his shoulder, and Margaret walked ahead of them saying something brisk and warm to Reverend Cullen, and Walt Prout disappeared immediately in the direction of the saloon, and the snow came down, and the world was cold and clear and beautiful. "Well then," Isaiah said. "Well then," Nora agreed. He looked down at her and smiled, the full version, the rare version, and it rearranged her completely, as it always did, as she suspected it always would. The first year of their marriage was not without its hard passages. Isaiah had never told her about the dreams. She discovered them in January, when she woke in the deep of the night to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to her, his shoulders rigid, and understood immediately that this was something that happened, that he managed it alone, that he had been managing it alone for 15 years. She did not make it dramatic. She simply sat up and put her hand on his back between his shoulder blades and kept it there, steady and warm, while the night settled back down around them. After a long time, he said, "The war does not stay in the past sometimes." "I know," she said. "You do not have to explain it." "I might want to," he said, "eventually. Whenever you are ready," she said, "I will be here." He turned and looked at her in the dark. "You say that very easily." "Because I mean it very completely," she said. He lay back down and she lay beside him, and he held her hand in the dark with a grip that was tighter than he would have allowed in the daylight, and she held back equally, and in the morning neither of them referred to it directly, but something between them had deepened again, quietly, permanently. Spring came and the land woke up in the way that Wyoming land wakes up all at once, insistently, demanding attention. Isaiah was up before dawn every day, and Nora rose with him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to be awake in the same world he was awake in, because the mornings before the rest of the world arrived were her favorite part of the day. She would have coffee ready when he came back in from the first round of the morning chores, and they would sit together for 20 minutes in the quiet kitchen, and she would think, "This is the thing that sustains a life, these small repeated moments of chosen togetherness." Margaret's health began to decline that spring, not suddenly or dramatically, but with the slow inevitability that comes when a body has worked hard for 61 years and begins to choose rest over exertion. Her arthritis worsened. She tired more easily. She began to let Nora take over more of the household management, not grudgingly. Margaret was not a grudging woman, but with a kind of pleased relief. "You manage it better than I ever did," Margaret said one afternoon, watching Nora reorganize the kitchen stores with the focused efficiency that characterized everything Nora did. You have a mind for systems. Years of necessity, Nora said. Whatever the cause, the result is excellent, Margaret said. Isaiah will not have to worry about any of this. Isaiah does not worry about things he does not need to worry about, Nora said. No, Margaret agreed. That is one of his better qualities. He reserves his worrying for the things that actually matter. A pause. He worried about you before you arrived. He did not know it, but I could see it. He was worried that someone new in the house would change things in ways he was not ready for. Did it? It changed everything, Margaret said. Entirely for the better. Nora smiled at the kitchen stores. In June, Nora realized she was pregnant. She was not certain at first. She had never been pregnant before and had nothing to compare the signs to, but the certainty arrived gradually and then all at once, the way certainty often does. She spent 3 days with the knowledge sitting privately inside her, not because she planned to keep it from Isaiah, but because she needed 3 days to fully understand what it meant, to let it settle into her body and her life, and her sense of what was possible for herself. She told him on a Sunday evening, the same time of day that had originally opened everything between them, that quiet kitchen space after Margaret's early retirement, the fire, the tin cups. She told him straight and clearly without preamble because she had learned that this man received directness best. "I'm expecting a child," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he was out of his chair and she was standing and his arms were around her with a tenderness and a care and a completeness that she had not expected, had not braced for, that went directly past every remaining remnant of her careful defenses. "When?" he asked against her hair. "January, I think," she said. Near, he held her for a long time. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said honestly. "So am I," he said, equally honest. "We will be frightened together." "That seems to be our method," she said. She felt him laugh against her hair, quietly, warmly, entirely. "It is a good method," he said. The pregnancy progressed normally through the summer and fall. Nora continued working, the store, the ledgers, the household management, because she was not a woman who submitted to being treated like an invalid without very good reason. And she had enough practical sense to know when to slow down and enough stubbornness to push slightly past that point, which Isaiah noted without lecturing about, because he understood her well enough by now to know that lecturing her about her own limits was a spectacularly unproductive use of everyone's time. He did, however, make very small and very quiet modifications to her environment in a way she found deeply endearing. The heaviest supply crates were always somehow dealt with before she arrived. The step that had developed a slight wobble was repaired the day she mentioned it, though she had only mentioned it once, casually, and had not expected action. Her chair in the kitchen had somehow acquired a cushion in October. She did not comment on any of these things directly, but she saw them, and she understood what they meant, and she loved him more for everyone. Margaret's health declined further through the autumn. By November, she rarely left her room before noon, and the store's management had fully transferred to Nora, who handled it with competent ease. Margaret seemed at peace with the diminishment in a way that concerned Nora less than it might have. There was nothing unresolved in Margaret Granger. She was a woman who had said what she meant and done what she intended for 61 years, and she was facing the body's natural slowing with the same steady practicality she had brought to everything else. In December, Margaret died. It was a Tuesday, which seemed somehow appropriate for a woman who had managed Tuesday mornings in the store for 30 years. She died in her bed in the early morning, quietly, apparently in her sleep, and Isaiah found her when he brought her coffee at 7 o'clock. He came back to the kitchen where Nora was making breakfast, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, and Nora looked at his face, and she set down what she was holding and went to him. He let her hold him, which was not nothing. He was a man who held other people, who took care, who managed, who did not easily reverse those roles. But he let her hold him in the kitchen doorway for a long time, and she felt the grief move through him the way a hard wind moves, and she did not try to stop it or fix it or make it better, because some things need to be felt completely. "She was ready," he said when the worst of it had passed. "I knew she was ready. She told me in October. She said he stopped, started again. She said she was glad she lived long enough to see me be happy. She said that was the thing she had most wanted. Nora pressed her hand against his chest over his heart. She got it, she said. She saw it. She did, he said. She did. They buried Margaret Granger on a Thursday in the town cemetery on the East Hill, with the mountains visible above the grave and the winter sky low and gray and absolute. Walt Prout was there, and Reverend Cullen and most of Carver's Creek, because Margaret had been a fixed point of the town for 30 years, and her absence would be felt in the particular way that certain people's absences are felt, as a change in the air, a shift in the known geography of things. Isaiah bore the service with quiet dignity, and Nora stood beside him the whole time with her arm through his. And afterward, walking back through town, he said very little, and she did not fill the silence, because she had learned by now that his silences were not empty and did not require filling. That evening he sat by the fire for a long time, and she sat across from him, and they were quiet together in the house that was now theirs alone, and in the quiet she was aware of the child moving inside her, a new, gentle, private movement that she had been feeling for weeks, and she thought about continuity, about how life threads itself forward through loss and love, and the small daily choosing of one another. She told him the baby had kicked for the first time that evening. He crossed the room and sat beside her and put his hand where she directed it and waited, and the baby obliged, and Isaiah Granger pressed his palm flat against his wife's side and felt his child move, and something in his face went completely open, all the walls entirely down, the whole man entirely present, and she watched it happen and thought, I will carry this moment for the rest of my life. Hello, he said to her side, very quietly, just that. Their son was born in January of 1880, on a night when the temperature had dropped below anything the thermometer could comfortably register, and the wind was making serious work of itself outside. Nora had insisted on having the local doctor, a capable woman named Dr. Hannah Pike, who had been delivering babies in the territory for a decade. And it was well that she had, because the labor was long and not simple, though its resolution was complete and good. Isaiah spent the labor in the kitchen because Hannah Pike had very clear policies about anxious husbands, and he paced the floor enough that Walt Prout, who had been keeping him company and losing at cards since late afternoon, eventually said, with his characteristic economy of words, "You're going to wear through the floor." Isaiah sat down. When Dr. Pike came to the kitchen door and said, "You have a healthy son, Isaiah. Your wife is tired but well," he was out of his chair before the sentence was finished. He sat beside Nora, who was exhausted and brilliant and slightly frightening in the way that women who have done something enormous often are, and she put their son in his arms, and Isaiah held the baby with the same carefully contained enormity he brought to everything that mattered to him deeply, and he looked down at the small, squinting, entirely perfect face, and then he looked at Nora. "Thank you," he said, "for everything you are. We should name him," she said. They named him Robert after no one specific, simply because they both liked the name, which felt like the right kind of reason. Robert Granger was a healthy and demanding baby who held strong opinions about the timing of his meals, and made these opinions known with a thoroughness that impressed even Dr. Pike. Nora navigated the newness of motherhood with the same approach she brought to all new challenges, with honesty about what she did not know, practical investigation of what she needed to learn, and an underlying certainty that she could manage it, because she had managed more difficult things. Isaiah was a father who took his son's existence with complete and slightly overwhelmed seriousness. He held Robert with the careful reverence he applied to breakable things, and he talked to him as he did every morning chore, a running commentary in his low voice that Robert seemed to find reassuring, because he quieted for Isaiah in a way that he did not always quiet for anyone else. And Nora, watching from the kitchen doorway, thought, of course he does. I understand completely. The years moved forward the way good years do, full and fast and accumulating meaning in layers. Isaiah expanded the herd and hired a second hand, a young man named Henry Casas, who had come up from New Mexico with excellent cattle knowledge and a quiet manner that fit the ranch's temperament. The beef market in the territory was strong through the early 1880s, and the Granger Ranch grew steadily, not dramatically, not with the kind of reckless expansion that was bankrupting some operations further north, but with the steady, careful ambition that was Isaiah's characteristic approach to everything. Nora continued managing the store, which she had taken over entirely by the time Robert was 2, and which she had quietly transformed over the following years into something considerably more professionally organized than it had been, adding a better inventory system, establishing reliable supplier relationships in Cheyenne, and developing a sideline in mail-order goods that significantly increased the store's revenue. She had a gift for it, for seeing what was needed, for organizing the getting of it, for the mathematics of commerce, and she exercised that gift without apology and with considerable satisfaction. Isaiah had no interest in managing the store and every confidence in her management of it, and told her so directly when she once, in an early moment of uncertainty, asked whether he was concerned about her decisions in a particular supplier contract. He had looked at her with something that was almost impatience, the closest he ever came to impatience with her. "Nora," he said, "you have been running that store better than anyone in this county for 2 years. If I had concerns about your decisions, I would have said so. I have not said so because I have not had concerns. Do you understand?" She had understood. She had not asked again. Between them, the love did what good love does over the years. It deepened past romantic feeling into something structural, something that was part of the architecture of their daily lives. They were not always perfectly in accord. Isaiah could go silent in ways that required careful reading. Nora occasionally managed problems alone when she should have shared them, a remnant of old habit. They argued sometimes, with the particular friction of two strong-willed people who have committed to the same small space and the same large life, and then they resolved their arguments with the same directness they brought to everything else, because they had both learned from their own histories that leaving things unresolved was a trap, and they were both done choosing traps. The intimacy between them was real and continuing and full. He knew the color of her thoughts in the early morning. She knew the particular cadence of his breathing that meant he was managing something difficult and did not yet want to speak about it. She knew that when the war visited him in the night, she needed only to be present, steady, warm. He knew that when she went quiet in a way that was not her peaceful quiet but her frightened quiet, what she needed was to be asked a direct question and given space to answer it honestly. They knew each other. It was the most sustaining thing Nora had ever experienced. In 1883, their daughter was born, Eleanor, who arrived with considerably less drama than Robert had, and who, from the first days of her life, displayed a temperament that combined her father's calm with her mother's sharp intelligence, in a combination that would, over the years, prove both remarkable and occasionally exhausting for everyone around her. Robert adored his sister immediately and completely, which surprised no one who knew Robert, who was 4 years old and had already demonstrated that he approached the world with his father's capacity for deep and serious attachment. The day Eleanor came home, Robert sat beside the cradle for an entire afternoon without moving, watching her sleep with the concentration of a person assigned a very important duty. "She is very small," he observed. "You were smaller," Nora told him. "I was not," he said with absolute conviction. Isaiah, across the room, met Nora's eyes over Robert's head, and they shared the specific amusement of parents whose child has said something completely wrong with complete sincerity. The 1880s in Wyoming Territory brought changes to the land, and the people on it that were not always comfortable. The cattle industry's boom years were not infinite, and the winters of the mid-decade brutal, prolonged. The kind of winters that broke smaller operations entirely tested everyone. The Granger Ranch lost cattle in the winter of 1886, a significant loss, painful, requiring the kind of hard decisions that keep a person awake through the long, dark hours. But they did not lose the ranch itself. Isaiah's management had always been conservative, always held reserves, always kept the debt below what the land could support if the market went wrong, and it was enough. Through those hard winters, the town of Carver's Creek pulled together in the way that small communities under pressure occasionally do, sharing resources, sharing labor, covering each other's gaps in the particular wordless way of people who have been neighbors long enough to know what is needed before it is asked for. Nora organized the relief coordination for 3 of the hardest months in the winter of 1886 to 1887, working with Reverend Cullen's wife, who was a formidably practical woman named Sarah, and with Dr. Hannah Pike, to manage the distribution of food and supplies to families whose situation had become critical. She did it without drama and without any expectation of thanks, in the way she did most things, and it worked because she was thorough and because people trusted her completely by now, trusted her accounting and her equity and her basic decency. Isaiah watched her do it and loved her with an intensity that continued to surprise him, even after 10 years, even though he should have been accustomed to who she was by now. He never quite got accustomed to it. He told her so, one evening in the early spring of 1887, when the worst of the winter had finally broken, and the ground was beginning to thaw, and the sense of surviving something enormous was settling over the land. They were in the kitchen, always the kitchen, the place where everything real had always happened between them, and she was writing up the final accounts for the relief distribution, making sure everything was documented, every receipt recorded, and he was at the table with his coffee watching her work. "You never stop surprising me," he said. She looked up. "How so?" "Every way," he said. "Every year." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the lamplight. "Do you know what I was afraid of, the night you said you were sorry for staying too long?" "Tell me," she said, though she remembered that night perfectly, as clearly as she remembered anything in her life. "I was afraid you would walk out the door and I would spend the next 30 years knowing I let the best thing that ever came to me go without a word," he said. "I was afraid of myself, of my own habit of silence." He looked at his hands. "I was afraid that my dark past and everything it had made me had cost me the one thing I had not known I wanted until it was about to leave. It was almost enough," she said quietly. "I was almost out the door." "I know," he said. "What stopped me was hearing the truth in your voice," she said. "Not just the words, the truth underneath them, that you were as afraid as I was." "I was terrified," he said. "I am considerably less terrified now." "Only considerably," she said. "Love is always a little bit terrifying," he said. "That is how you know it is real." She set down her pen and looked at him fully, this man who was 39 years old now, who had gray at both temples and new lines around his eyes, and who was the most familiar and the most essential person in the known universe to her. "I love you," she said. "I will keep loving you until I am done entirely." "Same," he said. "Exactly the same." They were quiet together in the kitchen while the spring crept back into the world outside, while the fire did its steady and faithful work, while the house settled around them with the comfortable certainty of a structure that has been well built and is entirely sure of its foundations. Robert was 9 years old in 1887, and Alina was 4, and they were both of them deeply alive in the way that children are when they have been given a home that is actually safe and parents who have actually chosen each other, who demonstrate, daily and without performance, what it looks like to build a life together with honesty and care. Robert was going to be a rancher. This had been clear from the age of 4, when he had begun following Isaiah around the property with the serious dedication of an apprentice who knows exactly what he is apprenticing for. He had his father's relationship with quiet, his father's patience with the long work of things, his mother's mathematical instinct applied to questions of cattle management and grazing rotation. Alina was going to be something that did not have a clear name yet, because she was interested in everything and excellent at most of it and absolutely refused to choose. At 4, she was already reading. At 5, she would be dictating letters to her grandmother in Ohio. Nora had reconciled with a distant maternal aunt in 1884, a careful and partial reconciliation that had given her a small thread of family back with a vocabulary that made adults blink. "She is going to terrify people," Nora told Isaiah. "She already terrifies me," he said with perfect sincerity, "in the best possible way." The summer of 1888 brought something Nora had not expected, which was a letter from Denver. The letter was from a woman named Louise Hartley, who had been a neighbor in the Denver boarding house where Nora had lived before coming to Carver's Creek, and who wrote to say that she had heard through a mutual acquaintance that Nora was in Wyoming married, which was wonderful, and also to convey a piece of information that Louise thought Nora ought to have. The man from Denver, the one with the freighting venture and the false charming manner, had been arrested in Colorado the previous year for fraud. Multiple counts. He had been convincing women to invest in his ventures for years. He was in prison. Nora read the letter twice. Then she put it down on the kitchen table. Isaiah looked at her from across the room. "What is it?" he asked. She handed him the letter. He read it. His face was very still in the way it got when he was containing something. "Good," he said, and his voice was entirely controlled. "That is what I thought," she said. He handed the letter back. "Are you all right?" "I am better than all right," she said. "I am sitting in my kitchen in my house in the life I built, and he is in prison, and I am extraordinarily well." Something moved across Isaiah's face that was not quite a smile but was its near neighbor. "Extraordinarily well," he repeated. "Do not push it," she said. He did smile then, the full version, and she thought for the 10,000th time that it was her favorite thing in the world. The years continued, layering into each other. The Wyoming Territory became a state in 1890, which the citizens of Carver's Creek marked with a celebration that lasted 2 days and involved considerably more of Walt Pruitt's homemade spirits than was strictly prudent, though Walt himself consumed the least of any of them and observed the celebrations with his characteristic stoicism. He retired from the ranch that same year, at 70, in good health, and moved into a small house in town that Nora had helped him find and arrange, because Walt Pruitt had been a fixture of their life for 12 years, and she was not going to let him retire into neglect. Henry Casas took over as foreman, which he had been effectively doing for 3 years already, and he brought in 2 more hands, good men, skilled, and the ranch continued its steady growth through the early statehood years. Robert at 12 was already doing real work on the ranch, not make work but actual skilled labor, alongside Henry, learning the operation from the ground up the way Isaiah had always intended. Isaiah taught him the way he did everything with patience, with directness, with the long view clearly in mind. Nora watched them sometimes, working together in the yard or in the barn, her husband and her son, and the sight of it filled something in her that she had not known needed filling until it was full, the sight of continuation, of a man giving what he had best to the person who would carry it forward. Eleanor, at 7, had decided she wanted to learn everything her mother knew about the accounts and the store, and also everything her father knew about the land, and also to read every book that could be obtained by any means available in Carver's Creek and its surrounding territory, which was an ambitious program that Nora encouraged completely, ordering books from Cheyenne and maintaining a correspondence with a teacher in Denver who had been recommended to her as someone Eleanor might one day study with. When she was older, "You are going to give her the education you should have had," Isaiah said once, watching Nora write an order for 3 new books that Eleanor had requested. "I am going to give her every education she wants," Nora said, "whatever that turns out to be." "Good," he said. "She will use all of it." "She will use all of it and then decide she needs more," Nora said. "She is your daughter," he said. "And yours," she said. "Mine would have been content with what was available," he said. "The part that wants more is entirely yours." She threw a dish towel at him, and he caught it. And this was entirely a Tuesday in the Granger household, and completely ordinary and completely extraordinary in the way that the very best things become. In 1892, Nora was 42 years old and Isaiah was 44, and they had been married for 14 years. And one morning in April she woke before dawn and lay in the quiet room listening to her husband breathe beside her. And she thought about the woman who had stood at a door with her hand on the latch and been ready to apologize for staying too long. She thought about what that woman had not known. Had not known that the man at the table had been sitting there for half an hour trying to find the words to ask her to stay. Had not known that the terror she was managing was the exact terror he was managing from across the same small space. Had not known that the thing she was afraid to want was already, somehow, wanting her back, not as a possession, not as an instrument, but as herself, entirely, the whole complicated real person of her. She had not known, and she had almost left, and the thought of it, of the life she might not have had, was the kind of vertigo that only comes when you fully understand how contingent everything is, how close the pivot points are, how much depends on the small brave acts of saying a true thing when the easier option is silence. She had stayed. He had asked. And here was what had come of it. This room, this man beside her, this house and land and life, the children down the hall, the whole accumulated weight of 14 years of choosing each other daily, of knowing each other in all the ordinary and extraordinary ways there are to know a person, of building something that was entirely theirs. She pressed her hand flat against his back, between his shoulder blades, the way she had the first time she had found him sitting on the edge of the bed in the night. He stirred half awake. "It is early," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Are you all right?" "I am extraordinarily well," she said. She felt him smile against the pillow. "Come here," he said. She moved closer, and his arm came around her, and she settled against his side with the ease of someone who has fit there for years and knows it perfectly. And the early spring light was just beginning to come at the edges of the curtains, and somewhere outside a bird was doing serious business, and the house was warm and solid and entirely sure of itself. She was home. She had been running for 6 years before she arrived here, and she had not known she was running toward something, had thought she was only running away from the wrong things, which was partially true. But she had been running toward this, without knowing it. Toward this man and this land and this life that had been waiting at the end of all that distance. "Isaiah," she said, "I have never once been sorry I stayed." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was full rather than empty. "Neither have I," he said, "not for a single hour of a single day." She closed her eyes, and the morning came, and it was good. The spring of that year brought something unexpected. A letter from Nora's aunt in Ohio, the distant maternal aunt she had been corresponding with for 8 years, whose name was Clara Briggs, who was 71 years old and whose health had declined to the point where she could no longer manage the house she had lived in for 40 years alone. The letter was careful and proud. Clara Briggs was not a woman who asked for things easily, but its meaning was clear. She was asking whether there was any possibility of Nora coming to visit, or perhaps of some arrangement being made. Nora read the letter and reread it and brought it to Isaiah in the evening. He read it. He considered it, which with him was a visible process even when the visible part of it was merely a particular quality of stillness. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to bring her here," Nora said. "If you are willing. She is old and she is alone, and she is the last connection I have to anything that came before all this, and she was kind to me in the only way she knew how to be, which was writing letters, which was more than most people managed." "Then bring her here," Isaiah said. "This is your home, you decide who belongs in it." "It is our home," she said, "which means you have a say." "My say is the same as yours," he said. "Bring her here." Clara Briggs arrived in Carver's Creek in June of 1892, on the same westbound stage that Nora had arrived on 14 years earlier, and stepped down into the summer dust with the careful movements of a woman of 71 years, who was not going to let her body make her look weak if she had anything to say about it. She was small, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, with a chin that suggested opinions held firmly, and the posture of a woman who had never in her life slouched. Nora met her at the stage. They had not seen each other since Nora was 12 years old, which was 30 years, which was long enough to make the meeting into something that required a moment of simply looking at each other and absorbing the reality of the other person. "You look like your mother," Clara said, which is a compliment. "You look like yourself," Nora said, which is also a compliment. Clara made a sound that was approximately the Clara Briggs equivalent of a laugh. Isaiah came forward and took Clara's traveling bag, and she looked at him with the sharp assessment of an old woman who has nothing left to lose by being direct. "You are the husband," she said. "I am," he said. "She chose well," Clara said, as if Nora were not standing directly beside her. "I believe I got the better end of the arrangement," Isaiah said, with complete sincerity. Clara looked at him for another moment, then at Nora. "I like him," she said. "I know," Nora said. "So do I." Clara Briggs settled into the Granger household with the adaptability of someone who has decided that adaptability is required, and therefore it will be produced. She was exacting in small matters, and surprisingly easy in large ones. She adored Robert and Eleanor with the fierce, slightly surprised affection of an old woman who had not expected to love children this late in her life, and found herself entirely wrong about that. Eleanor in particular became her devoted shadow, drawn by the depth of Clara's knowledge of things: history, literature, the geography of places she had read about but never seen, and Clara, for her part, recognized in Eleanor the kind of intelligence that deserves to be taken seriously, and took it seriously accordingly. She died in the winter of 1895, quickly and without great suffering, in her sleep, as Margaret Granger had, which Nora thought was the universe being merciful in a way it sometimes managed. She was buried in the Carver's Creek Cemetery on the East Hill, not far from Margaret, because she had become, in 3 years, genuinely part of the place. Nora grieved her, genuinely and completely, and was grateful for every year they had had. Robert turned 17 in 1895, and Eleanor was 12, and the ranch was its strongest it had ever been, and the store was expanding, and Carver's Creek itself was growing more families, a new school, a new doctor in the territory since Hannah Pike had moved to Cheyenne, a telegram office that had been there since 1889 and still felt slightly miraculous to people who remembered the days when information traveled at the speed of a horse. Isaiah was 50 in 1898, Nora was 48, and he did not seem particularly troubled by it, because he was a man who measured time in terms of what was present rather than what was past, which was one of the qualities she most loved in him. He had the appearance of a man who had lived considerably outdoors for decades, weathered, solid, the gray fully through his hair now, and she found him, at 50, as viscerally appealing as she had at 39, which she had not shared with him because she was not entirely willing to give him that particular piece of intelligence, though she suspected from certain things he said and certain ways he looked at her that he was aware of it anyway. Robert married in 1900, which was the year of the new century, which felt significant to everyone in the way that even practically minded people sometimes allow round numbers to feel significant. His wife was a young woman named Ada Pierce, daughter of a neighboring ranching family, 20 years old to Robert's 22, with a steady temper and a dry humor, and the kind of physical competence on a ranch that Robert correctly identified as essential. They married in the same clapboard church where Isaiah and Nora had married, with the same Reverend Cullen presiding. He was in his 70s now, still sharp, still exactly himself, and Nora sat in the front pew and watched her son marry and thought about continuity, about everything that threads forward. Isaiah held her hand through the ceremony. She held back. The year 1900 also brought the news that Eleanor, now 17, had been accepted to study at a school for women in Denver, a serious academic institution that had been there since the 1870s and whose educational programs were genuinely rigorous. She was going to study mathematics and natural science, which she had decided was her particular territory after years of reading everything available. Isaiah had initiated the correspondence with the school 2 years earlier, quietly, without telling Alina until the inquiry had produced a positive response from the school's director, because he had wanted to know it was possible before raising her hopes. When he had told Nora what he had done, she had looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "What?" he had said, with the slight wariness of a man who is not sure whether he has done something right or something wrong. "You," she had said, "just you." He had understood what she meant. He always understood. Alina's departure for Denver in September of 1900 was managed with the practicality that Alina brought to all things. But Nora saw, in the careful way her daughter embraced her at the stage, that she was moved, that she was aware of the weight of it, that she understood something about her parents and what they had built and what was being carried forward. "Thank you," Alina said, into Nora's shoulder, in a tone that meant everything beyond the words. "Go learn everything," Nora said. "Then come back and tell me." Alina laughed her father's laugh, the rare full version, and climbed onto the stage, and the stage left, and Nora and Isaiah stood in the Carver's Creek Road watching it go until it was out of sight. Then he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against his side, and they walked back through town, past the store she had been running for 22 years, past the church, out the road toward home. 3 miles, she said. "Same as always," he said. "I have walked this road many times," she said. "So have I," he said. "I prefer it with company," she smiled. "Do you now?" "Specific company," he said. "Not general company. Your company specifically, Nora Granger." She had been Nora Granger for 22 years, and it still sounded right. It had always sounded right. It sounded like something that was accurate, something that described a real thing about the world. "I love you," she said, on the road between town and home, with the autumn sun on their shoulders and the mountains visible to the west and the whole of the life they had built spread out around them in every direction. "I love you," he said, "more than the first time I said it, which was more than I imagined possible then." "It grows," she said. "It does," he said. "I did not know that before you. I did not know that it could keep growing." They walked home in the October afternoon, and the mountains caught the low sun and turned golden, and the sage was sharp and clean on the air, and ahead was the house that was theirs, that had been theirs for 22 years, that held the weight of everything they had built. The years and the children and the grief and the joy and the 1,000 ordinary, extraordinary evenings in the kitchen and the 10,000 times they had chosen each other daily, without performance, without drama. Simply because it was true, and they were both people who tried to live in accordance with what was true. The house waited for them. They went in. The kitchen was warm. The fire was low but alive. There were letters on the table from Alina, from Robert and Ada, who were expecting their first child in the spring, which would make Nora and Isaiah grandparents, which was a thing Nora was still arriving at the full reality of, still turning over in her mind like something beautiful she had found unexpectedly. Isaiah put on more wood for the fire. Nora put on the coffee. And they settled into the evening the way they always had, the way they had been settling into evenings together for 22 years, with the comfortable ease of two people who have learned the particular geography of each other completely, and find it not diminishing but deepening. Each year another layer of knowing, another increment of the trust that had begun on a night when she had put her hand on the door latch, and he had said the words that changed everything. "I have been sitting here the last half hour trying to figure out how to ask you to stay longer." She had stayed. She was still staying. She would stay. The coffee was ready, and she poured 2 cups, and she set one in front of him, and he looked up at her with those dark and careful eyes that had been watching her for 23 years, and had never once looked at her as anything other than exactly who she was. And she sat down across from him in the kitchen that was theirs, in the house that was theirs, in the life that was entirely and completely theirs, and the fire burned warm and steady, and the Wyoming night pressed its cold blue dark against the windows. And Nora Easton Granger was home, and she was known, and she was loved, and she had never once been sorry she stayed.